Dr. Rosie Sprague, thank you so much for joining me. It is an absolute privilege.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so very excited.
I wanted to talk to you for a lot of reasons, but the reason I wanted to talk to you at this moment is November is Native American Heritage Month. And at the outset of our conversation, I was curious if you could share a little bit about what this month means to you and why it's important we observe it.
This month obviously is generally by most of the population in the United States is recognized as Native American Heritage Month, which is really kind of poignant. I think for me being a Native American person and a professor of American Indian Studies, um, that they chose November because obviously we have Thanksgiving and that's kind of an issue. um, but no, it's a really nice time, I think, for a lot of people, especially K through 12 teachers, to kind of like emphasize Native culture in their classrooms. And then you have a lot of people on campus who are interested in having speakers just to get education out. Whatever topic that we can focus on is kind of, again, whatever we can do to enhance cultural knowledge of Native peoples in everyday life of students, community members, right? That's what this month is about.
And I feel quite lucky that I got to take multiple classes with you, and I get some feeling that Black Hills State, given its size, is quite unique, right? In the sense that it has the Center for American Indian Studies, which is a program that was created when?
In the early 1970s, I want to say 1973 or 74, it was under legislatively created here in South Dakota. Um, and so it was created to be for Native students, so kind of like Native Student Success Center, resources for Native students on campus, but also it houses the academic side. So we are actually really unique in the fact that our Center for American Indian Studies studies 100% Native student success and 100% our AIS program here on campus. And so we work as one, where other campuses, SDSU, USD, their faculty and staff, unfortunately, are kind of separated in the fact that they don't really mix or talk to each other where we do all the time. So we kind of know what's going on, and we kind of have our hand in a lot of different pots when it comes to either courses or students.
So I'm curious, what drove you to teaching and researching at BH specifically?
Well, it came from, I actually have a science background. I'm an alum of Black Hills State. I have a science background in American Indian Studies and Earth Science as well. But I think it really came from working with Native students, because when I first started here in 2012, I started with the Center for American Indian Studies as the assistant director, where I worked completely with students and I worked with advisement and just really getting to know students. And the need for American Indian faculty, I can see that because we did have our Professor Emeritus, Jace DeCory, who was our lead faculty, and she unfortunately passed away. But stepping in to fill her shoes, I think, was really important to me because she brought with her all of this knowledge. Um, and it's important to keep that going, especially here in the Black Hills. So I think it's important that our Native students see a Native person faculty as well as non-Native students saying, "Oh, I'm actually getting information from somebody who's not only Native but from this area."
When I look back to my high school education, I think of the year-long courses in American government, year-long courses in American history, and often we spend months at a time talking about big things like the Civil War, which, granted, is a massive part of American history and should be talked about. But from my experience, and I think it's transferable to others as well, many American students go through K through 12 education learning very little about the history of Native American relations with the U.S. federal government, and especially the issue of tribal sovereignty. So I guess forming this into a question, why do you think that is?
Well, for one, I think the way our public schools were developed and the curriculum that was developed and continues to be developed, they do not really reach out and get a native person to help develop curriculum. A lot of states are requiring that now, but in the beginning, right, your focus was on math, right, history, government. Um, but native culture was never really a part of that because I think a lot of Americans really thought as native people as like, I always use this example, like we're dinosaurs, right? Like we kind of no longer we're an ancient people that really didn't exist anymore. And so kind of like dinosaurs, you can teach a little section of dinosaurs in whatever class and then you're done with it and good, let's move on. Same with native culture. Usually it's like a little section of maybe the history, maybe you learn about, I don't know, buffaloes and teepees, and then they move on, right? I think it's the same kind of process. I also think for me personally, that Americans really traditionally had a hard time with, I guess, taking. I don't. I want. I don't want to say guilty, but feeling bad about what happened to Native peoples, about the acts against Native peoples, and so America doesn't like to be put in a bad light, right? And we want to be the best at everything. And so for the US government in particular to shine light on the atrocities that happened just wasn't a good look for our country. And so I think that's another reason why we kind of glaze over what happened or sweep it under the rug. But I do see change coming in K through 12, which is really a good thing for Native people, Native communities to see more and more non-Native K through 12 teachers reaching out and asking for curriculum, asking for help in that area.
And this is why the work that you do is so important because so many students who go to BH, for example, don't get that exposure to this history in high school. And they come and they take a course through the American Indian Studies program, such as myself. And I'm curious, just what what do you observe when you teach non-native students and they're engaging with this history, these topics for the first time?
So, what I have seen over the past few years, just with those students who have no idea, right? Which because there are, and it's not their fault, right? It's not their fault that they don't have any idea really of the history of Native peoples in this country. For the most part, or non-native students are really interested, and they're like, "Wow, I never knew that." Case in point is talking about the boarding school era, right? Most have never heard that before and are just like astounded that this even happened in the United States and in Canada. So I get a lot of that. I used to get a lot of like, why do I need to know this? Especially for our teachers, our future teachers. I also teach South Dakota Indian Education course, which is required by all teachers who will be teaching in South Dakota. And I used to get a lot of the kind of pushback from teachers requiring recertification, especially those coming from out of South Dakota, kind of saying, why do I need to know this? Why do I have to take this class? I'm never going to teach Native students. Um, and we have to respond with, well, we know even if you're not teaching on the reservation, doesn't mean that this information isn't important. And so our response to when we hear that is, um, well, even if you're not teaching Native students, non-Native students need to hear this too, right? Because our non-Native students are probably the population that needs to hear it most. So when they come to university, they can be, oh, my teacher taught us about boarding school. My teacher taught us about Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse or, Jim Thorpe, right? Have this a little more education on it when they get to university. I think every student in this country as freshmen or sophomores, juniors, seniors in university level should have some sort of course about Native peoples of this country, at least one. So that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, when we look at whether it's the Census Bureau, the federal government, or the social sciences, it seems that Native Americans and indigenous tribes are often treated as a homogenous group, right? Native Americans. But it seems to me that that couldn't be further from the truth. So I'm curious if you could just touch upon just how diverse is when we classify this massive group of people with a very rich and diverse culture as one.
And we use the term pan-Indianism, right? It is just that, just kind of classify we're all one people, we're all Native American. And again, this idea comes from, I would say, two things. Again, in my opinion, I would say one of it was Hollywood. I really blame Hollywood for a lot of these stereotypes because in Hollywood, they did just that. They lumped us all into one kind of Native person. And it was usually plains kind of tribes that you see in early Hollywood film. And what they did in Hollywood was one, just kind of lumped us into one kind of Native person, didn't really explore any other kind of Native languages. And it's really funny because in a lot of those old films, you'll hear uh, bits and pieces of Lakota. It's because they focused on Lakota people as they wanted to see this kind of Native person character. Um, so that's one reason. And another reason, unfortunately, is government wanting to assimilate Native people. They wanted to assimilate us, acculturate us. And so they took away our language, they took away our culture. And so that kind of really made us into that kind of one group. So by making us into one group, we're forgetting our culture and hopefully, right, getting into just being a westernized people, U.S. citizens, and that was it. So that's kind of two reasons why we have this idea that we were just kind of one culture and not 560 plus different federally recognized tribes.
On the on the U.S. Census Bureau, how are Native Americans classified? In, are they still referred to as Indians?
I believe it is American Indian Alaska Native.
Okay.
So even that, right? Not even asking for, not saying Native American. I do believe that they ask if you want to put your tribe. I think there's like a sub question that says, please list what tribe. Um, I've never looked and to check to see how many tribes that they have listed. Um, but I'm guessing they have the major ones. I know that when I last did that, they had mine because I'm from Standing Rock and I could check Standing Rock. But I do believe it's just American Indian Alaska Native.
Okay. And given this lack of awareness for so many Americans, I didn't understand what tribal sovereignty was until I first got a chance to come to university and learn about these things. But there's a clear tendency to just view tribal nations as part of the greater U.S. without their own form of government and self sovereignty, which is not true. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on what we mean when we talk about tribal sovereignty.
So tribal sovereignty has, oh goodness, throughout the years, the many years, we've always had this relationship with the government that we're sovereign, we're not, they're big brother, we're not. So it was really an up and down relationship with the US government. It continues to be. But tribal sovereignty for us is just that. At the very beginning, it was for us to determine how we were going to live our lives and how we would protect our family and our relatives. And so the chiefs had to make some really tough decisions. And so at the time when the treaty making era, right, when we're making treaties, the chiefs had to make tough decisions on whether we would let go of our land and move to reservations, right? And so that was the sovereignty we had at the time. As we move throughout the many different eras of federal Indian policy, we see this trust relationship develop with the U.S. government. And they really took on, depending on what federal policy we were in, what era, they were either big brother to us and telling us what to do, or they go back again to like, oh, you're sovereign again, so you can make decisions for yourself. Um, we are currently in self-determination era, so that means we are making more decisions and really we are really attacking our own sovereignty, meaning I'm attacking it and coming into a place where we are grabbing our sovereignty and we are education, health, we are taking these over now and saying we are able to determine this for ourselves. We don't really need your help anymore. um, so that's kind of where we're at right now with tribal sovereignty, just kind of really digging into especially education, right? How are we determining our future for our children, right? Especially with language. You're seeing a lot of Native nations who are now teaching their students in their own language, which is really cool to see.
And it would strike me that this ebb and flow between more of a paternalistic relationship with the federal government versus a more hands off relationship, this back and forth, would limit progress.
And it
It would,
has in the past. Exactly. It has because again, it's whether they're big brother to us and telling us, this is what you have to do now, as a part of these funds that we are, I'm not saying gifted to because these funds are coming out of treaties that we leased, not leased land, but we gave land for these rights. Um, and so the government really, again, do they have a hands-on or a hands-off kind of approach? And that really did hinder, again, at the tribal governance level, what we can do as Native people and what we couldn't do as Native people. So yeah, very true.
and I got a chance to talk to your colleague, Professor Wyant. We talked about social movements in the 1960s. And something that was left out of our conversation was a discussion on the American Indian movement. And this is really taking shape in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Could you explain a little bit about how this emerged and what the movement advocated for?
So the movement itself emerged again early 1960s. It actually, Minneapolis, Minnesota, is where they first formed the group. Um, Russell Means was one of the head people to form this. But again, it came out of basically what Native people were seeing happening with civil rights movement, um, with Black Americans fighting for their civil rights. We kind of said, hey, we can do this too. We can stand up for our own people, and especially during those late 1950s, early 60s, where Native people were moving to urban areas under urban relocation program, which was actually under termination era. Again, this all kind of falls back to some kind of federal era of Indian policy. But so Native people were sent to places like Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, Seattle. Minneapolis was one of them. During that time, there was a lot of racism towards Native people. We were new to the area. We were new to being in this urban area. Um, and so we see a lot of racism, also a lot of police brutality. And so because of that, it actually is credited with grandmothers, Native grandmothers in the area saying we need somebody to look out for us. And so these men and these members came together and said, let's form this American Indian movement they actually started with neighborhood watches in the Minneapolis area for their own people. They actually continue to do that to this day. Um, but that's where that started, and from that grew a multitude of events. And then you see the rise of American Indian movement and then what they call the Red Power movement, which kind of both were the same thing. You see the takeover at Alcatraz happening. I think that was 1968 or 69. And again, basically fighting for Native rights and recognition of Native issues, really. Um, the American Indian movement is best known, obviously, for what happened at Wounded Knee 2 in the 1970s. And again, that came from an outcry of Native elders who said, what was happening, issues happening on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and they needed help. And so AIM came to help those Native people, the elders there at Pine Ridge. Other issues, one issue that arose was in the early 70s, and it was a man named Wesley Badheart Bull, who was a ranch hand near Pine Ridge. who was killed by two non-native men. And they were arrested and tried, and they're only given manslaughter. And so the relatives of Wesley Badhar were outraged, calling for AIM to come again and help. Unfortunately, that ended really badly for both sides. There was huge physical altercations in Custer. I think the Chamber of Commerce even burned down. And so because of that, the US government kind of um, focused more on AIM being kind of this militant, angry mob kind of style. And so they kind of got under the radar of the US government. And so when Wounded Knee 2 happened, it wasn't, it was obvious why troops were sent in to that area to deal with AIM and what was going on there.
How did Alcatraz, Wounded Knee 2, how do these big moments affect public perception of the movement?
Like I said, the U.S. government now started to see this movement as militant and kind of scary. But for the public, this was really the first time because you now have television who are covering these events right at Alcatraz, and you had uh, dozens of TV reporters who were sent to Wounded Knee 2 to cover this event. So you were now getting to see it happen in real time on TV. And I think a lot of the American public had no idea of, for one, that there were Native people still around, and two, about the issues happening with Native people. You start to see a lot more celebrities who are getting very interested in what was going on in Native country. Marlon Brando is a famous celebrity actor who was very much, he was a part of a lot of protests. Johnny Cash wrote a whole album about Native issues, which never aired on the radio, obviously. But yeah, so you really see this time where a lot of Americans who had never heard of these issues are really probably saying like, wow, what is this? What's happening? Right. And even not even here in America, just all over the world, starting to see issues happening with Native people and starting to really see Native people stand up for themselves and saying, we're not going to take this anymore.
Yeah, I think it's in the early 1970s, Marlon Brando wins Best Actor for The Godfather and has an Indigenous woman accept the award on his behalf. The exact situation is blanking me, but there was a very racist person on the stage at the time. It was, but quite fascinating to think about how these movements affected public perception and created kind of an epicenter event of public awareness of different things going on. And when you think about Native activism today and the lasting legacy of AIM, what what are some of the big topics in Native activism today?
Big topics are the one thing that a lot of people don't understand is when we're fighting for our rights and we're fighting for treaty rights. That's a big thing, is that a lot of our protests come from um, issues with treaty rights and issues with breaking of those treaties. And people are, I think a lot of Americans are like, why does this bother you? This happened hundreds of years ago. Why is it still relevant? And I think that's the reason that we do this, is because it is relevant. This treaty is still a thing. Um, we didn't break the treaties, right? We didn't do that. And so a lot of our protests stem from that treaty making time. Take No Dapple, for instance. This is a very current event. Protesting went on for months in North Dakota. Why? Because they were going to build a pipeline through our land. Well, what does that even mean? What does treaty land even mean? And we having to explain what this is and why we're fighting for it. So again, many of the things that are happening in the protests and the American Indian movement, what they stood for, again, stems back from issues that we had gone through um, with our elders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And it's still very much relevant, which I think is really hard for a lot of Americans to perceive or understand.
Yeah. We touched upon this earlier, but I would like to dive a little bit deeper into this. I think if it was Dr. Sprague's world, the world would be a little bit better. It'd be much more kinder. But if you were in charge of curriculum, what would you want K through 12 education in everyday American public schools to look like in regards to native education?
I think that for me, it would be because wherever you are in this country, you're going to be on native land. It's going to be native ancestral land to some tribe. So I think for me, it would be so beautiful to see wherever the school is, whether it's in Washington State or California or South Dakota, to look into the culture of those tribes, right? As individual tribes and the culture of that state, right? Or what was it like before it was even a state? Who were the people there? I think that would be, really good. And obviously, in kindergarten, you're not going to talk about the Wounded Knee Massacre, right? But introducing, I think, students to the idea that yes, there were Native people here. There continue to be Native people here. This is what they look like, right? This is what they sound like. This is their art. This is their culture. I think those ideas can be introduced at a relatively young age. And then again, moving through high school, I think as they get older, they can tackle things like the Battle of Greasy Grass or Wounded Knee Massacre, and they'll have a better understanding of these issues if they're introduced at an early age. I also think it's important, would be spectacular if we had classes who would focus on tribal governance, right? Teaching those students what is a treaty, right? What is sovereignty? Like introducing them to these ideas so when they get to high school or when they get to university, they already have a background in that, right? Just as important, like I know K through 12, you probably learned about the judicial system, right? The executive branch, all of those things. You probably had to memorize all of those for a class, right? Well, why not add that as a tribal governance to one of your classes? So again, just opening up ideas, opening up young minds to the many different cultures of this country. I think that would really, really help, uh, especially in K through 12.
And I try to, use the last few minutes of any conversation I have as a hopeful note, right? Because we do not exactly live in hopeful times. And I'm not going to ask you to speak for the entire Native American community, but I'm just curious, in lasting oppression and lasting attempts to erase history and culture, how have, how has your community around you persevered and maintained closeness and a determination to maintain culture, maintain all the legacy?
So again, like you said, speaking for myself, it really has to do with again being connected to culture, being connected to the land, being able to go back home where my mother lives in North Dakota and visit relatives and talk to relatives and hand down oral history. That's the biggest thing for me is being connected to cultures, handing down oral histories not only to my children but to my students. I love talking about my family history to my students because it teaches them a little bit about our culture, not only as Lakota Dakota people but as Native people in general. And so I'm really hopeful for that we have this incoming, I guess, this generation of young Native people who I'm seeing who are going to college, who are not only graduating with their 4-year degree, but going on to their masters and going on to their PhDs. I have numerous Native students who have I advised or taught who are done with their PhDs. We're seeing more and more young Native people who are getting their education and not only just getting an education, but going home and helping their people or helping their people in some sense. We're seeing a lot more of that. So that really gives me hope for the future of our people. But another thing that gives me hope, and I've really thought about this, is seeing the amount of non-Native students here at Black Hill State and all over the country who are super interested in learning more about Native history and culture, because I think there is a lot of yearning for that. And again, a lot of young people who are saying, why wasn't I taught this? really asking that question. And that's really hopeful because, again, it's kind of opens up the possibility that I can learn about these cultures and I don't have to feel guilty because it wasn't me that, right? It wasn't this your generation. Nobody did anything wrong, right? And I always try to tell my students that you don't have to feel guilty when we cover these subjects, these tough subjects. Please don't feel guilty because it wasn't you, it wasn't your parents or your grandparents that did this, right? But it's important that we learn about it because, again, American Indian history is American history. And I think it's just as important as learning about the Civil War, right? Even when we talk about the French and Indian War and Civil War, American Revolution, we have to include American Indians in that because they were involved in those wars as well. So there's a lot that I think that can benefit both Native and non-Native people, and we do have a lot of Native students who never learned about a lot of this as well. So they're learning too.
You mentioned earlier this tendency for some to never want to view the United States, America in a bad light. And I couldn't think of a more American ideal, right? If we recognize that we're never perfect, we're always striving to be more perfect in pursuit of equality before the law, the equal treatment of all. I couldn't think of a more American thing to do than to emphasize uh, these topics in education and to spread awareness around them. And so I don't think, at least from my perspective, I don't think there should be any, you know, fear of viewing America badly just by recognizing mistakes that we have made in the past because it only helps us learn and be better in future generations.
Exactly. You're exactly right, right? How do we get better, right? What is that quote? You get bound to repeat history if you don't know your history. And so again, I think every aspect of American history, it should be like, yes, we're taking it. This is our history. We're owning it, and it makes us better. And again, just by that information, I think is great for all Americans.
Yeah. And my last question I have is kind of selfish because it's just as much for me as it is for anyone else. But if you could recommend a book, a film, a documentary, any of the sort that touches upon modern or historical Native American topics, what would you recommend?
I have a few here for you. The first one, I don't have, obviously, it's documentaries that I think are really brand new, made by Native people for everybody, as the Lakota versus the United States. That one just came out. It focuses on Fort Laramie Treaty, things that are happening with the Black Hills, the land back issues. Um, and then this one is actually just really good in general. It's a Jim Thorpe documentary. It's called Lit by Lightning, and it was produced by LeBron James and directed by Chris Eyre, who's a native director. And I know Jim Thorpe, and it's about Jim Thorpe, but it has a lot of the culture in there. It talks about boarding school era because he went to Carlisle, an Indian school or industrial school. So it talks a lot about that. So those are kind of two newish documentaries that are really cool. For books, I have these three. This one's an older book. Um, but it's called History of the United States and Indigenous Peoples History. Um, this is a great one. They have a children's version of this as well for teachers. So this is a good one. My next one, this one just came out, I think like a year or two ago. This is really good. This is by Ned Blackcock. He's a native writer, says The Rediscovery of America. This one's also a really good read for that history. And lastly, this is by Nick Estes. He is native, and it's called Our History is the Future. So I think those are some three great books if you really want to get started on kind of like that. Again, the history of Native Americans, government issues, things like that, and even current issues like No Dapple are in there. So
Dr. Sprague, I say this from the bottom of my heart. You are a beloved member of the Black Hill State community. As long as, along with other students who've taken your classes, are so grateful to have had that experience.
thank
You lead
you.
with kindness, intelligence, and awareness, and I am so grateful to have been able to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so proud of you. We're also proud of our Black Hills students who they go on and get more education and doing great things. And I really love your this idea, our great experiment. I think this really needs to happen right now. More talking and more understanding and being open to ideas of every American. I think that's what we need right now. So I really love this what you're doing here. So I think it's awesome. But thank you for
Well, thank
inviting me.